Welcome back to another episode of the Engineer Future Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Luis Duque. I have Nicolai here with me. How you doing, Nicolai?
Doing pretty good, thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited about this episode. I know we're kind of coming on the end of the year, kind of looking at goal setting, kind of what 2025 is going to look like, which is kind of wild because I felt like 2024 just kind of flew by. And yeah, I just kind of wanted to discuss. I know we've done maybe one or two of these in the past, kind of towards the end of the year, but just kind of looking at 2025, there's a few things that I want to personally do differently. And I think you had a little experimentation this year as well. So I thought it was going to a great opportunity to just kind of discuss and just give some guidance for our listeners on how to prepare for goals. If it's not a deep dive into goal setting and kind of all these strategies and everything, but at least a little overview of, hey, these are some of the things to consider, especially as you end the year, begin the year, and maybe are in that mindset of, hey, I'm gonna make 2025 a little better and kind of um, practice that goal setting that is maybe a little challenging if you haven't done it before.
Yeah, and I feel like goal setting, yes, we have talked about it in some way before, but I think it's one of those topics that you can address it from different angles, multiple different ways. Maybe, we said something last time that didn't resonate, but, we covered it a little differently this time. So I feel like it's one of those topics that definitely can be discussed multiple times, and there's always a takeaway. So, for those of you listening that have heard us talk about goals before, I hope you still stick with us and see what your main takeaway from this time is.
Yeah, and like, and just kind of getting started with that, like I have here in my notes and kind of when we were talking before, kind of that four-step process, which I really like. It was very simple. You may have not even thought about it when you texted to me, and but what it resonated a lot with me. And it was celebrate progress. I think starting with a positive mindset, it's very important, and then you go into identify the goals, which obviously is what we're talking about here today, as well as the gaps, which I don't think we think too often about when we're setting goals. Because we're kind of looking to and we're excited about thinking big and growing and whatnot. But thinking about the gaps is what really is going to make those goals happen a lot of times. And then lastly, create a game plan, which again, when you have a goal, if you don't create that game plan, you're just kind of going through the year without really thinking about it. You want to just give us a kind of a quick overview, kind of what you were thinking when you sent that, and maybe again you were maybe not thinking too much about it when you did.
Oh no, I definitely was thinking about it. So for me, yeah, that little four-step process. We've talked about SMART goals and stuff like that, but for me, the overall picture of how do you set goals and what do you go about doing, celebrating your progress. There's some times where I get really bummed out when I don't hit my goal. And here we are, end of November, Thanksgiving is this week, and I start to think about what have I done this year. And sometimes I think, oh man, I did a really good job with this. And other times I think, oh, I really dropped the ball on that, right? I mean, we're human, we never have a perfect year. So, there's some wins and some losses. But for the losses, I used to really get down on myself and sad and about, just man, I really blew it. And then I had to think, I still made progress. And even if I did 80% of the goal and still failed, 80% is a lot. Like let's say I had a goal of reading, 30 books. 80%, what is that? 24 books? I think reading 24 books in a year is still more than most people. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's definitely more than most people I talk to. So celebrating, hey, I didn't hit the goal, but look how far I came, and that's pretty cool. If you've never set goals before and this is your first time thinking, okay, I want to get serious about a clear game plan, a clear goal setting guide here, just kind of look back and think, what are the things that you were proud of this year? What are the things that made you happiest this year? What were the things that you felt like you experienced the most growth this year? And celebrating is such a huge part of the goal setting process. Otherwise, like, what's the point? If you're just setting goals, checking them off, and then going to the next one, you're gonna burn out. Even though you're successful and even though you're moving your life forward and some of these goals forward, it's gonna be really sad. And I tell that from experience. There have been times where I had just amazing 2 3 year spans, and it was like the saddest I had been. And it was just like the most unfulfilled that I had been. And I talked to a friend of mine. I was just like, I'm not like trying to pat myself on the back here, but look at these things that I've done. Why am I so down? Almost depressed. And he's the one that actually taught me about celebrating. And this was years ago. And ever since then, I've started adopting it, and I feel like things have just gotten so much better. And then you have this positive outlook, a kind of a positive energy going into the actual goal setting planning for the next year. So step one is really important.
Yeah, and I like that just in terms of just being positive about it. I think we often, especially if you're very ambitious, you kind of look at the negatives so you can improve on. But if you start with the good things are you're looking forward to, good things that happen in the year. And I like this concept that you have shared. I think was the last year, a couple years ago. Whenever you receive a good email or praise or anything, just forward it to either a separate inbox or a folder or whatever in your inbox. And then when the annual review comes by, you have a list of things that you did well, and it's going to be a lot easier to show that to your manager and say, "Hey, look all the great things that I was able to do." Like the argument becomes a lot easier. Um, Saving it doesn't have to be email. It have to kind of be in your notes. Could just be in a piece of paper. You write them down, anything, but at least kind of keeping track of those. I think it's super super important, and I really like that little tip that you shared before. Let's talk about identifying goals and like how do you start looking at, hey, what are some of the goals I want to do in 2025? And maybe you already are thinking about this already. I personally haven't, but I'm just kind of curious. So how maybe some of the ways that people can look at and say maybe like a guideline, like, hey, look at these different areas in my life and how can I plan and find the goals that are going to be meaningful to me.
I think it's important to kind of identify a few different life categories. And so maybe that's going to be relationships. So that could be, family and friends, fatherhood, motherhood, whatever it might be, relationships. You can kind of lump it all up into that. You could do personal finance, you can do personal growth, adventures and hobbies, work. And then, I mean, if you Google like life balance or life wheel, that's the easiest place to start. But you'll get, from 5 categories to like 12 categories. So you just find the one that resonates most with you. So yeah, you'll go through that and identify some of these categories. And then what I do, I go down in each one and I think, okay, what are some of the areas that I want to improve? So when I was younger, personal finance was a huge struggle of mine. So in my earlier years, my goals mostly centered around personal finance because I had to get out of debt and I wanted to get my savings in place. So there was many, many years where like that was my number one priority. And so when I would look at my goals for the year, I might have like 5 or 6 goals in my personal finance side, but maybe like 1 or 0 goals in my personal growth side because I thought I don't have time to read books. I need to go mow people's lawns and pay off this debt. So just that's how I did it. So I write down a whole bunch, and at first I would just brain dump. Anything that comes into your mind, just do it. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can refine it later. Once you kind of get 1 to 5 goals per category, which you definitely are not going to be working on 25 goals at a time, but 1 to 5 goals per category. Then start going in and start cutting them out of like, oh yeah, okay, that one sounds good in my head, but it's not really important to me. A lot of young people I find put goals down because their parents want them to have that goal or their significant other wants them to have that goal. And while it's like, all right, it's good to have mentors and people that speak, truth and love into your life and hopefully want the best for you. At the end of the day, if that goal is not yours, you cannot keep that on your list. So you keep that in mind. Make sure it's yours. And so you're brainstorming, you're throwing everything down, and then you start to cut and trim and refine. At the end of the day, I try to have like 1 to 3 goals per category, and then I will choose like 3 to start working on at a time. I try not to work on more than 3 goals at a time, unless it's more of like a habit goal. So, man, we could spend the whole rest of our show just on that. But habit goals and then like achievement goals. Achievement goal is I want to earn this or I want to achieve this. Habit goal is I want to do this every single day or I want to do this every single month or whatever it is. They're very different. You can do habit goals. You can do multiple at a time, even though I still wouldn't recommend doing more than like five at a time. But if it's a new habit, I would treat that as like its own goal and only do one new habit because it's hard to implement five new habits at the same time. I think that's where a lot of people get stuck is they're going to go and say I'm going to do all of these at once, and then by the middle of January, they're so burned out and lost and just like I don't know what we're doing anymore, and they give up everything, right? So start small and start right. Choose one at a time if it's a new habit goal. But anyway, so you brainstorm, whittle it down, and then you choose about three to actually work on at one time. Now we've talked about smart goals and hard goals and all these other different ways of actually putting the goals, writing them down, and all of that. But as far as like easy steps, that's kind of what I would do. And honestly, for me, every year I start doing this process around Thanksgiving. I might have a notes thing in my phone, or maybe I have a notepad on my computer, and anytime something pops in my head, I'll just put it on there, and then probably after Thanksgiving is when I start to whittle it down. So it's perfect timing. If people got this episode sooner than later, if they got it before Thanksgiving, this would be perfect timing for them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to just simplify what you're doing. Doesn't have to be complicated. I think we've said this in the past, and I will link the episode we did last year. I think we talked about smart goals versus clear goals and kind of what the difference are and kind of the steps that each of those can entail. But just keeping it simple and keeping the process simple, I think it's gonna allow you to do it year over year. And obviously, if you think about it and just kind of dump everything on a piece of paper and narrow it down and make sure the goals that you're putting in there are applicable to what you want to be doing and that are
Yeah.
truly meaningful. Because otherwise, like you said, they're not gonna do anything for you. They're just gonna stay in your list and kind of go down the hill and really don't get anything done with that. So you gotta make sure they have like an emotional component to it. I think that's kind of one of the clear letters in that episode, having an emotion behind it. So for you, I think we're talking about the finance part of it. So there was a big emotion. Hey, I want to get out of debt. This is my goal. I want to work hard to it. So maybe identifying that component, I think is kind of my tidbit of information there. Let's talk about the gaps. I think the gaps is an interesting one and something that I hadn't like fully think before, but I think it's very important. And I think this is where journaling has come big into my practice as well because you're thinking about some of the things that happen through your day, you're reflecting, and if you review those journals or at least like process it in a way, you start seeing these patterns like, hey, I know I need to be working out more. I'm gaining weight very slowly over time, like, and you can catch that before it's too bad. Or you are at work and you notice like every week your supervisor is telling you, hey, you're taking too long to this, or hey, you are maybe struggling to manage your time or collaborate with others. So you start seeing these patterns that are the gaps that you need to fill when you're practicing your goals. And I think that's something that I hadn't fully done in the past. I mean, I've done journaling on and off. I think we talked about that in the past. But the process of actually going back and reviewing them and identifying those gaps, I think, has been a big thing for me in 2024, especially during the time that I took a big break of the podcast and everything, job transition, big life changes. Kind of looking back at those entries, I'm like, hey, there was some stuff going on here. I want to make sure I look ahead and create those habit goals for one, making sure I'm working out frequently, making sure I am putting time in the calendar to spend with family, but at the same time looking at the goals, maybe looking at the gaps on my work and maybe some of the things that I could improve and bring to this new position and to the new year and make it even better than before. So I think that was a really interesting kind of thought process. And I have I didn't journal every single day, but I have a good number of journals from this year that I'm kind of taking the time and looking back and making sure I am analyzing that and bringing those gaps into my goal setting process.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I think that journaling too is a really good way of just kind of keeping track of what you did and what you are struggling with or what you are celebrating, I think journaling is a really smart idea. Identifying gaps, that's a really important one because sometimes, again, we put this goal on paper that sounds really good, but we are nowhere close to even starting on it, right? So I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. If if I want to run a marathon, right? Right now, me, Nikolai, November 2024, I'm at least a year plus from running a marathon. And on paper, a run a marathon might sound really good. I have to be really honest with myself and identify what is my major gap of even just starting on this goal, and it's almost kind of like you're going to set a goal and then you should be refining it with like step by step chunks, like little chunks, like how to eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? Like you don't want to have run a marathon. Maybe you have run a marathon as your ultimate goal, but then you break that into little baby chunks. But there might be a gap that I need to fill that gap before I can even start anything towards that. Maybe I don't own a pair of running shoes. Maybe I don't I don't know. Whatever it is, like the gap. Money is another good one where you think, okay, I want to invest, but maybe the gap is I need to get out of debt first. And but it's hard to be honest with yourself because you want to be starting on that cool sounding goal, but what you really need to do is fill out kind of the foundation, get the foundation set, fill in those gaps, and you have to be honest with yourself there and just say, yeah, I don't have what I need in place right now, but these are the things I'm going to get into place, and then I can kind of start progress towards the ultimate goal. Even though that filling in those gaps and all of that actually is getting you on your way, you're not going to see a whole lot of progress until you really close those gaps.
Yeah, and I think with that, the thing that comes to mind, and this is a concept that I heard, I want to say it was last year. I'm sure Cal Newport is one of the people that I follow, and I love his books and everything. But he has this concept of the multi-scale life-centric planning. So I think that's kind of similar to what you're talking about. Is looking at your values, your goals, your ambitions, everything in terms of like your life, and planning your career goals around that. And the multi-scale comes into, hey, I have a goal, like you say, run a marathon. I think this is kind of something that is nothing like new or just out of concept. And you talk about the quarters and you talk about the months and the weeks. But important part of that is keeping each of these time frames kind of top of mind throughout the year. So you're looking at these time frames frequently. So you may have a goal of, hey, I want to make sure I'm running 5 miles by March. What are the monthly goals that I need to do to accomplish that? What are the weekly goals that I need to do to accomplish that? What are the daily things I need to do to make sure I am making progress towards that? And a lot of times we set the goals and we just kind of forget, hey, I want to run a marathon by the end of the year. And you start great. Hey, January, New Year resolutions. I'm going to be focused on these every single day. By February, you start like, hey, I missed a few days. It's okay. I'm going to maybe come back in March. And by June, you're like, way past any motivation or factor of doing anything. So keeping that time scale and that multi-scale planning, I think is super important. And I'm planning on doing my own like little dashboard on Notion in terms of like, hey, these are the big goals I'm gonna do this year. These are the medium goals. Here are the steps that I'm gonna follow. These are my mission. These are the things that I want to be doing to keep them top of mind, not even to like just have them for the sake of having them and doing the planning, but I want to make sure I'm more intentional in 2025 because I feel like in the past I've just, hey, I want to grow the podcast to these many views per month or per episode, and I set the kind of input goals, which are great. I'm going to be recording every week. I'm going to be publishing every week or every other week, whatever it was at the time, but then I'm not really looking at that more often. I'm just kind of setting the automatic goal. It's more of the habit goal, and it's been great. Obviously, this year we took a big break, but the outcome hasn't been what I wanted. And then just kind of keeping track of that, I think is going to allow me to put more intention into it. Like, why am I doing this? Why? What's the value that this brings to my life, to my career, to my ambitions? and kind of keep them top of mind. I think that's going to be super important. And yeah, I don't know if you heard that concept before, but it's a and again, it's nothing new. You just kind of plan your days, you break it down. It's just a different way of thinking it and aligning it with your own life, your personal goals, and your own kind of ambitions.
Yeah, no, I love that idea and that concept, and definitely something that we all should do. Because when you throw out this huge thing, and it could be a little overwhelming, but you start breaking it down, you're like, oh, I can take this step. Okay, now I can take that step, and before you know it, you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, look at I took 100 steps, and look how far I've come. It didn't feel like I made that much progress at once, but you look back and really see how far you've come. That's really fun to do.
Yeah, and I think with that, let's jump into the last bit, which we kind of touched a little bit of just kind of that game plan. Like we have your goals,
Mhm.
you have your gaps. What's the next thing that you need to do? Obviously, put everything together in a plan. And
Yep.
I'll say this is probably the hardest part for me of the whole process. I'm great at just kind of brainstorm ideas. Hey, I want to do this. I want to do that. These are some of the things that I need to work on. Putting it together, sometimes it feels a little more overwhelming because you like how detailed do I want to be in November for something that's going to happen in June of next year? Like how much detail I'm going to be trying to think about when it's going to be really hard for me to really think about all of that. So I'd like to think about it, and I'm going to try this a little bit in 2025, more of a just in time goals. So you start the year, you have this big picture goal. Hey, I want to do X, and each quarter you start looking at the goal and like adjusting, which I think we talked about this in the last episode of smart and clear goals, but doing it more intentionally. Hey, am I on track to this, or is this just so far fetched that it's going to be really hard to do it this year? Maybe I need to scale it down. Maybe I'm already at the goal in March and I need to increase it. um, Doing that review, that monthly review, the quarterly review, it's going to be very important to me, I think, in 2025, in terms of I want to make sure I am pivoting as needed and kind of just keeping that just in time mindset of for goal setting. Like maybe in March, something happens in my life, my career, whatever, and the goals that I had set in November are no longer applicable. I need to change them and look for something else. So that's what I'm kind of thinking ahead for 2025. I think you had done a little bit different goal setting in 2024, and maybe you will carry that over to 2025.
So actually, you've kind of touched on it. I like your Notion idea of having have a dashboard where you can see it. Quarterly reviews, monthly reviews are super important, but you can't do that review if you don't actually create the plan. And this year I kind of did an experiment, and it's been a really different year for me, where I've been doing goal setting now for 12, 13, maybe more years. I think maybe I was 25 when I first did it. And this year is the first year since I was 25 that I did not write down my goals for the year. Last year, around Thanksgiving, I was on a big project, a design build project, and it was just that was my only focus. And that was going to take me all the way through April. And I just said, you know what? I'm just going to wing it this year. And I mean, I'm going to put air quotes, wing it. I've been doing this so long, I still had them in the back of my head, right? Like, I still want to read so many books. I still want to do so many dates with my wife, stuff like that. But like, um, I didn't write them down, and I do feel the effects of that. There was a point, I think, in the summer where I thought maybe I'll just write them down now because I didn't like the feeling. Felt a little lost, if I'm honest. I felt a little like I was just floating and wandering. And again, I had it in my head, but writing it down either on paper or on a computer just changes the thinking of it, or it gives you something to reference back to, right? Uh, you can't do a quarterly review if you have nothing to review, right? So, getting it down on paper is going to be a big deal. Another benefit of getting it down on paper is we set goals very idealistically. So, I'm going to run a marathon. I'm going to read 50 books. I'm going to take my wife on a date every week. I'm going to make X amount of dollars, and I'm going to invest all these dollars, and I'm going to take my family on vacations, and then I'm going to do all those things, right? Each one of those individually is amazing, but some of those count against each other, right? Like investing extra, but then also taking your family on vacations. You only have so much money. Like, you got to choose one or the other. So you gotta take that into consideration. Or reading 50 books. That's like I this year, even without setting goals, I'm on track. I'll probably read about 35 books this year, and it's actually the most books I've ever read, which is kind of cool because it was a good year. I had a lot of fun reading a variety of different books this year. Um, but I just kind of fell into it. It was not intentional. It was like an idea, um, but it just happened by accident. And not a lot of things will happen by not a lot of good things are going to happen by accident. So getting your game plan down, writing it on paper, revising it because when you see it again on paper, and you see, oh man, these are counting against each other, or they're not attainable all at once. Maybe I need to break it up where I can do these two first and then I can focus on those two. Just makes it more real. And then you can kind of do the timeline that you were mentioning of, okay, I'm going to break these down and maybe I won't touch that till June. So I'm not even going to get too specific until then. It's going to be on my paper that I'm going to look at every single week. Normally at my old jobs where I actually had like my own little desk, I would take my goal sheet, which had my wheel on it, and it would have kind of my gaps for each one. Like each category of my life, I would list my gap. That way, it's in my face all the time. And then I would have my goals for each one, and I would put that on a wall right next to my computer, so I literally saw it every day. Those years were fantastic years, and without having that this year, I just felt off. So I'm excited to be done with this experiment. I'm very excited to start my goals for 2025, and like I said, I've already been thinking about them. But yeah, this is a great episode to kind of get that kick started for me.
Yeah, and let's plan a recap in maybe mid January on how things kind of went through that process, and especially maybe like you now doing it again, maybe after not doing it last year, and like maybe how that felt and all that. We'll do a kind of follow up episode on that. But yeah, I wanted to just kind of wrap up the episode on in terms of just kind of giving a quick overview of some of the things we talked about. So we talked about the 4-step framework, which I thought was great. I don't think I've ever think about it so clearly in terms of like, hey, 4 steps, nothing complicated. There is no need to make it hard or challenging for yourself, especially when you start thinking about goals. You always think, hey, I'm gonna be doing a lot of things in 2025, and it's very hard for our minds to really grasp how much we're doing in a year. It's a long time frame. I can't even think what I'm gonna do in next week. So at least writing them down, and I think trying to think about them as they come. Like, maybe I set a small goal for January, maybe it's a larger goal for June, and kind of staggering them a little bit. I think you talk about, hey, you don't want to do more than 3 at a time. That's going to be a little too challenging for you, but you still want to do some other stuff during the year. So maybe staggering them a little bit, making sure you plan them out. I think that's going to be very important. So I really like that four step process that you shared. And yeah, do you have any kind of final thoughts, suggestions, maybe call to actions to the listeners want to do kind of before the end of the year?
I mean, number one would be please just do it. It will change your life. And even if you just did one goal and it's a smaller goal, but just to get you to like see how it works, test it out, kind of learn the process, just do it. I mean, I know some of us are not as goal oriented. They want to be more free spirited, but goals don't put you in a box. They just are directing kind of a direction, right? You'd always pivot, but I would say just do it. If I were to give one final tip, and you kind of hit on this a couple times, is just make it simple. Keep it simple. There is no reason to complicate it, because if you complicate it, you're not going to keep it up. The simpler it is, the more likely you are to continue with it, to finish it, see it through, and then maybe make it complicated next time. But just start small. I mean, I still am very simple. Even in my goals sheet, it's like one word. I'll just put a number and I know what that number is. It's not this elaborate thing where I've written this whole paragraph down. Like, just keep it simple. And that would be my best tip I think we can give through this episode.
If you really enjoyed this episode of the Dream Future podcast, you're going to love the content we have over our website at luisfelipeduque.com. You can find the link in the description of this episode, as well as the show notes at luisfelipeduque.com/podcast. Every episode comes packed with a lot of links, a lot of information. So you can find all the show notes and all the information related to this episode over at luisfelipeduque.com/podcast. Thank you so much for coming back to this episode. Thank you, Jack Winters, for the music. And as always, let's continue engineering our future.